The German shepherd's paw struck the study window with 3 deliberate taps, each one measured and urgent, pulling Domenico Caruso from the abyss of his 3rd sleepless night. Through the glass, amber eyes locked onto his with an intelligence that defied animal instinct, communicating something primal that bypassed logic entirely. His 6-year-old son, Paolo, had vanished 72 hours ago from the fortified estate, disappearing between the moment his nanny checked on him and the 10 minutes it took for her to return with warm milk. No ransom demands had arrived, no bodies discovered, nothing but silence that devoured Domenico from the inside out. The morning sun barely penetrated the dense canopy of pines surrounding his property, casting his study in shadows that felt accusatory. Maps covered every surface of the mahogany desk, circles drawn around neighborhoods, forests, waterways, anywhere a small boy might wander or be taken. His men had searched until their voices went hoarse, calling Paolo's name, but the forest swallowed sound like it swallowed hope. Local authorities maintained polite distance from Domenico's tragedy, unwilling to investigate too closely into the affairs of a man whose business dealings existed in perpetual twilight. Domenico had inherited his father's empire at 24, 4 years before meeting the woman who would become Paolo's mother. She had been light itself, somehow seeing past the blood on his hands to something redeemable buried deep within. They'd had 6 perfect years before cancer claimed her, leaving Domenico with a son whose eyes held her gentle spirit, and a grief that calcified into something harder than any criminal conviction. Paolo was his redemption made flesh, the single thread connecting him to humanity, and now that thread had been severed. The dog tapped again, more insistently, its muscular frame silhouetted against dawn's pale emergence. Something in those eyes reminded Domenico of his late wife's gaze when she'd been keeping secrets, the kind meant to protect, rather than deceive. He'd never seen this animal before, yet it watched him with recognition, as though it had been searching specifically for him. The shepherd's coat gleamed dark sable in the weak light, impeccably maintained despite appearing from nowhere. Domenico crossed to the window, his hand trembling as it reached for the latch. Sleep deprivation made reality feel negotiable, but the desperation clawing through his chest demanded he follow any lead, no matter how impossible. The moment he opened the window, cold forest air rushed in, carrying the scent of cedar and damp earth. The shepherd backed away 3 precise steps, maintaining eye contact, its posture communicating expectation rather than threat. "You know something," Domenico whispered, his voice fractured from disuse and screaming his son's name into an indifferent wilderness. The dog tilted its head, then turned deliberately toward the tree line where morning mist clung to ancient trunks like ghostly sentinels. Every instinct forged through years of navigating criminal underworlds told Domenico this was either divine intervention or elaborate trap. Yet what choice existed when your child's absence carved holes through your lungs with each breath? He grabbed his jacket without bothering to inform his security team, men trained to kill but helpless against a disappearance that left no trail to follow. The shepherd waited at the forest's edge, patient as death itself, watching Domenico descend the stone steps from his study's private entrance. Dew soaked through his Italian leather shoes immediately, but physical discomfort registered as distant static compared to the screaming void where his son should be. The dog moved the instant Domenico reached the tree line, not running, but maintaining a steady pace that assumed he would follow. It navigated between towering pines with supernatural confidence, occasionally glancing back to ensure Domenico hadn't fallen behind. The forest here was old growth, protected by environmental laws that even his influence couldn't circumvent. Ironic, given his wife's passionate speeches about preserving wild spaces. He'd nodded along while mentally calculating profit margins, never imagining these very trees might hold answers to his unraveling. 20 minutes of hiking brought them to terrain Domenico had never explored, despite living adjacent to these woods for 8 years. The shepherd moved through brambles and over fallen logs with liquid grace, while Domenico crashed behind like a city-dwelling fool chasing phantoms. His lungs burned from cigarettes and stress, but adrenaline provided fuel that rational thought couldn't. Somewhere overhead, ravens called warnings that went unheeded by both man and beast. The shepherd paused beside a creek swollen with spring runoff, turning to fix Domenico with another of those unnervingly intelligent stares. It seemed to be gauging whether he possessed sufficient determination to continue, whether he deserved whatever revelation waited deeper in these woods. Domenico met the animal's gaze without flinching, pouring every ounce of paternal desperation into that silent exchange. After a moment that stretched into eternity, the dog dipped its head once, almost a nod, and continued across stepping stones Domenico hadn't noticed. The forest grew darker as they climbed, the canopy so dense that morning might as well have been dusk. Ferns covered the ground in prehistoric abundance, and moss transformed every surface into something primordial and untouched by modern corruption. This was the world his wife had loved, the wilderness she'd disappeared into for hours during their marriage, returning with dirt under her nails and peace in her expression. He'd been too consumed building his empire to ask where she went, what called her away from their temperature-controlled mansion. The shepherd's ears suddenly pricked forward, its entire body going still with focused attention. Domenico froze behind it, hand instinctively moving toward the pistol holstered beneath his jacket. They'd reached a small clearing where sunlight managed to penetrate, illuminating something that made his heart seize with recognition. Draped over a low branch, as though carefully placed rather than discarded, hung Paolo's favorite jacket, the blue windbreaker with reflective strips that his nanny had helped him pick out 3 months ago. Domenico stumbled forward, snatching the jacket with hands that shook so violently he nearly dropped it. The fabric still held warmth, suggesting it had been worn recently, that Paolo had been here, alive and moving. He pressed the material to his face, inhaling his son's scent mixed with wood smoke and something else. Herbs, maybe, or wild plants he couldn't identify. The shepherd watched this display of raw emotion without judgment, sitting patiently as Domenico's knees threatened to buckle. Beyond the clearing, partially hidden by overgrown vines and decades of neglect, stood a stone cabin that seemed to have emerged from the forest floor itself. Its walls were constructed from river rock mortared together with such skill that time had barely touched them, though wooden shutters hung at odd angles, and the roof showed gaps where shingles had surrendered to gravity. The shepherd moved toward this structure with purposeful determination, its nails clicking against a stone pathway that led to a weathered door hanging ajar. Domenico followed because alternatives no longer existed. His son's jacket clutched against his chest like a talisman. The cabin's interior was surprisingly dry, despite its apparent abandonment, dust motes dancing in light that filtered through broken windows. Simple furniture remained, a table, 2 chairs, shelves lined with mason jars containing substances he couldn't identify. Someone had been here recently. A blanket lay folded on the narrow bed, and the stone fireplace contained ash still soft with recent warmth. The shepherd moved to the far corner where a wooden chest sat beneath the room's single window. It scratched at the chest once, twice, then looked at Domenico with unmistakable instruction. His hands trembled worse than before as he crossed the room, every horror his imagination could conjure playing through his mind. The chest wasn't locked, the hinges protesting but yielding when he lifted the heavy lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect against moisture, he found a stack of photographs that stopped his breath entirely. The top image showed a young girl, perhaps 8 years old, standing in this very clearing with a smile that punched through Domenico's chest like a bullet. He knew that smile, had fallen in love with its grown-up version, had watched it fade during chemotherapy sessions that stolen everything beautiful from the world. His wife stared out from the photograph, decades younger but unmistakably her, surrounded by people he'd never seen, a family that had never been mentioned in the life history she'd shared. Behind them, barely visible in the photograph's background, sat this same stone cabin looking much better maintained than its current state suggested. Domenico's legs finally gave out, sending him to his knees on the cabin's dusty floor, with the photograph clutched in white-knuckled fingers. His wife had never mentioned growing up near these woods, had claimed a childhood in the city, with adoptive parents who died before they met. Every story she'd told about her past suddenly felt like carefully constructed fiction, and the betrayal cut deeper than any enemy's knife. The shepherd approached and pressed its cold nose against his hand, offering comfort that somehow made the moment more surreal. The remaining photographs told a story his wife had taken to her grave, summers spent in this cabin, teenage years captured in fading color showing her teaching younger children to identify plants, graduation celebrations held around massive bonfires, her wedding to Domenico himself with these mysterious people present in the background, where he'd never noticed them. He'd been so focused on her walking toward him that day, so consumed by disbelief that someone so pure would choose someone so stained, that he'd failed to truly see who stood witness. Now those faces stared at him from frozen moments, accusing him of willful blindness. The German shepherd suddenly moved to the door, releasing a low whine that communicated urgency without aggression. Domenico forced himself to stand, tucking several photographs into his jacket pocket alongside Paolo's windbreaker. Dawn had fully broken during his time in the cabin, forest sounds increasing as the world woke to another day his son remained missing. The dog's body language had shifted from patient guide to active hunter, every muscle coiled with purpose that demanded immediate action. They descended from the cabin into a ravine Domenico hadn't noticed during their ascent, the shepherd navigating steep terrain with confidence that suggested intimate familiarity. Water trickled somewhere nearby, the sound growing louder as they pushed through dense undergrowth that showed no signs of trails or human passage. His expensive clothes snagged on thorns and brambles, collecting mud and tree sap, transforming him from crime lord into desperate father with each ruined garment. The contrast between his manicured estate and this raw wilderness felt like crossing into another dimension entirely. The ravine opened onto a clearing where a stream cut through ancient rock formations, creating natural pools that reflected the canopy above. The shepherd stopped at the water's edge, lowering its head to drink while keeping one eye fixed on Domenico. He knelt beside the animal, cupping cold water to his face, the shock of it cutting through exhaustion and emotional overload. His reflection wavered in the disturbed surface, eyes hollowed by grief, stubble darkening his jaw, the polished veneer of control completely shattered. Movement in his peripheral vision brought Domenico's hand to his weapon, before conscious thought registered the action. A woman stood among the trees on the opposite bank, so still that she might have been carved from the forest itself. She watched him with eyes that held the same unsettling intelligence as the shepherd's gaze, her clothing practical and earth-toned, blending seamlessly with the surroundings. Long, dark hair hung in a braid over one shoulder, and her feet were bare despite the cold ground, suggesting either insanity or adaptation beyond his understanding. The shepherd barked once, sharp and commanding, then began crossing the stream using rocks as stepping stones. The woman didn't flee or react with fear, merely continued watching Domenico with an expression he couldn't decipher. When the dog reached her side, it pressed against her leg in obvious affection, and she placed one hand on its head without breaking eye contact with Domenico. That gesture of familiarity confirmed what he'd begun suspecting. This animal hadn't found him by accident. "Who are you?" Domenico's voice emerged rough and threatening, despite his intention to sound calm. The woman's lips parted as though to answer, then closed again, her brow furrowing with what looked like frustration. She raised one hand to her throat, shaking her head slowly. An understanding crashed over him like ice water. She couldn't speak, whether from injury or birth he couldn't determine, but her silence was absolute. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd built an empire on carefully chosen words and negotiations, now confronted with someone beyond his primary weapon's reach. The woman gestured toward the forest behind her, a sweeping motion that encompassed the deeper wilderness, then pointed at Domenico with clear intention. She wanted him to follow, to trust someone who emerged from nowhere with a dog that knew too much, and secrets that involved his dead wife. Every survival instinct screamed this was a trap, that he was being led away from safety into ambush. Yet she made no move to threaten, and the shepherd sat calmly at her side, its tail sweeping the ground in patient expectation. "My son," Domenico managed, his voice breaking on the second word. "Paolo, 6 years old. Have you seen him?" The woman's expression transformed instantly from guarded neutrality to something approaching compassion. She nodded once, firmly, then gestured again toward the forest with increased urgency. Relief and terror collided in Domenico's chest with physical force. She knew where Paolo was, which meant his son was alive, but also deeper in this wilderness than any search party had penetrated. The woman moved before Domenico could formulate further questions, not running, but maintaining a pace that required him to push his exhausted body into stumbling pursuit. The shepherd flanked her like a trained guardian, occasionally dropping back to ensure Domenico kept up. They traveled through terrain that grew increasingly rugged, climbing over fallen trees and ducking beneath low-hanging branches. His lungs screamed protests, muscles burning from exertion and lack of sleep, but giving up meant abandoning his only lead to finding Paolo. 30 minutes of relentless hiking brought them to a section of forest so dense with undergrowth that penetration seemed impossible. The woman paused, glancing back at Domenico with something like apology, then dropped to her knees and disappeared into what appeared to be solid brambles. The shepherd followed without hesitation, and Domenico had no choice but to do the same, thorns tearing at his jacket and exposed skin as he crawled through a tunnel barely wide enough for his shoulders. He emerged on the other side bleeding from a dozen scratches, his expensive clothes in tatters, looking more like a vagrant than the feared head of a criminal organization. The woman stood waiting in a space that defied everything he understood about his surroundings. They'd entered a hidden valley, protected on all sides by steep hills, covered in such dense vegetation that discovering it accidentally would be nearly impossible. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden shafts, illuminating structures that made Domenico's breath catch in disbelief. A complete settlement existed here, hidden from aerial surveillance and ground exploration, existing in deliberate secrecy from the modern world. Cabins similar to the abandoned one dotted the valley floor, connected by worn paths and surrounded by carefully tended gardens. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and the sound of children's laughter drifted through the air, a sound that brought Domenico to a complete stop, his heart hammering against ribs that suddenly felt too tight. The woman walked confidently toward the nearest structure, the shepherd at her heels, while Domenico followed in a daze that bordered on hallucination. People emerged from cabins and gardens, watching his arrival with curiosity rather than alarm. They wore simple clothing, most of it handmade from natural materials, and their faces held a peacefulness he'd never encountered in his world of constant violence and negotiation. Several children peeked from behind adult legs, their eyes wide with the innocent fascination of youth encountering something unfamiliar. Then he saw him, Paolo, sitting beside a fire pit in the valley's center, completely absorbed in learning to weave what appeared to be a basket from willow branches. An elderly woman sat beside his son, guiding small hands with patient gestures, speaking in low tones that carried affection rather than threat. Paolo looked unharmed, clean, and startlingly content, showing none of the terror Domenico had imagined consuming his son during 3 days of absence. The relief was so overwhelming that Domenico's vision briefly darkened, his body swaying as delayed shock finally caught up with adrenaline's depletion. Paolo! The name tore from Domenico's throat in a sound more animal than human, loud enough to startle birds from nearby trees. His son's head snapped up, eyes widening with recognition, but instead of running toward safety, Paolo's expression transformed into something complicated, guilt mixing with joy, fear blending with protective defiance. The boy set down his basket carefully, murmuring something to the elderly woman, before standing and walking toward Domenico with deliberate slowness that suggested reluctance rather than eagerness. Paolo stopped 3 feet from his father, close enough to touch but maintaining distance that communicated something fundamental had shifted during their separation. The boy looked healthier than Domenico had ever seen him, color in his cheeks from outdoor activity, dirt under fingernails from honest work, a light in his eyes that the mansion's sterile luxury had never produced. That vitality was a silent accusation, suggesting these strangers had provided something essential that Domenico's protection and wealth couldn't replicate. "I'm not lost, Papa," Paolo said quietly, his small voice carrying conviction that belonged to someone much older. "I came here on purpose. They said you would come looking, that the dog would bring you when you were ready to understand." The words didn't make sense, implying premeditation and conspiracy that a 6-year-old couldn't orchestrate. Yet Paolo stood his ground with determination Domenico recognized from his own reflection, the stubborn certainty of Caruso men throughout generations who'd built empires on refusing to yield. The elderly woman who'd been teaching Paolo basket weaving approached with slow dignity, her weathered face holding kindness that made Domenico's defensive instincts scream warnings he couldn't articulate. She was perhaps 70, with silver hair braided in the same style as the silent woman who'd guided him here. Deep lines around her eyes suggested a lifetime of smiling rather than suffering, and her hands were gnarled from manual labor, yet gentle in their movements. She studied Domenico with the assessing gaze of someone who'd spent decades reading people beyond their carefully constructed facades. "You have your mother's eyes," she said to Paolo, her voice accented with something regional Domenico couldn't place. "But your father's fire, a dangerous combination if not properly guided." She turned that penetrating stare on Domenico, and he felt stripped bare under scrutiny that somehow saw past his reputation into the frightened man beneath. "Your wife spoke of you often during her visits here. She loved you desperately, but worried what world she'd brought a child into by marrying into yours." The revelation struck Domenico like a physical blow. His wife had maintained connection to this place throughout their marriage, visiting without his knowledge, discussing their life with strangers he'd never been allowed to meet. The betrayal he'd felt in the cabin intensified, mixing with grief that had never properly healed from her death. These people had known her in ways he apparently hadn't, understood pieces of her soul she'd deliberately hidden from him. The shepherd sat beside the silent woman, watching this confrontation with patient attention that suggested it had witnessed similar scenes before. She never told me about any of this, Domenico managed, gesturing at the settlement, at Paolo's contentment, at the community that existed in impossible secrecy. Never mentioned a childhood here, never brought me to meet. His voice broke as the full scope of her deception settled into his consciousness. Who are you people? Why did she keep you secret? The questions emerged hostile, defensive against the evidence that perhaps he'd never truly known the woman he'd mourned for a year. The elderly woman's expression softened with something approaching pity. She kept us secret, to keep us safe from your world, and to keep you safe from knowing she hadn't fully left ours. My granddaughter was born in that city your kind controls, adopted by people who promised her safety from the violence that came for her parents. She paused, letting that information settle. Your wife was my granddaughter. This valley has been our family's home for 5 generations, hidden from those who would destroy what they cannot control or profit from. Domenico's legs threatened to give out for the second time that morning, the implications cascading through his understanding of everything he'd believed about his life. His wife hadn't just hidden her past. She'd been running from something, or towards something, or maintaining dangerous dual existence between 2 incompatible worlds. Paolo, standing here, suggested she'd been preparing their son for eventual integration into this hidden community, training him for a life Domenico had never been meant to understand. The shepherd whined softly, and the silent woman placed a calming hand on its head. The photographs in the cabin, Domenico said, fighting for composure. Her parents, the ones who adopted her, they're in those pictures. The elderly woman nodded, sadness crossing her weathered features. They were part of this community before moving to the city, tasked with raising her away from danger that found us despite our isolation. But she always knew how to find her way home, and she brought that knowledge to Paolo during the last months of her illness. Paolo took a tentative step forward, his small hand reaching for Domenico's. Mama made me promise not to tell you until I was older, but she showed me the paths through the forest. She said someday I might need to know there was another place, another family, if things in your world became too dangerous. The confession emerged in a rush, as though Paolo had been carrying it like a weight since his mother's death. I didn't mean to scare you, Papa. I just needed to see if it was real, if they were still here like she promised. The valley seemed to hold its breath while Domenico processed information that rearranged his entire reality. His wife had been preparing an escape route for their son, insurance against the violence that had always been potential, rather than guaranteed in Paolo's existence. She'd loved Domenico enough to marry him, to bear his child, but not enough to trust that world wouldn't eventually consume everything she held precious. That lack of faith cut deeper than any enemy's betrayal ever could. Your wife asked us to watch over Paolo if something happened to her, the elderly woman continued, her tone gentle but unyielding. The dog was hers, trained to protect your son and guide him here if necessary. She didn't expect cancer, didn't plan to leave so soon, but she made provisions because she understood the life you lead always carries consequences. She gestured toward the settlement, toward people who'd begun returning to their activities, while maintaining careful awareness of the drama unfolding. We've kept this valley hidden for over 50 years, protecting land and wildlife from developers and those who would exploit it. Your wife spent her last year ensuring those protections would continue after her death. Domenico finally found his voice, though it emerged hollow with exhaustion and emotional overload. She was dying and spent her time protecting trees instead of... He couldn't finish that sentence, couldn't articulate the hurt that she'd chosen secrecy and preparation over shared grief. The elderly woman's expression hardened slightly, the first real sternness she'd shown. She was protecting her son's future, building him a sanctuary if your choices made his life with you impossible. Surely you understand the need for contingency plans in your line of work. The practical assessment struck home because it was absolutely correct. Domenico had backup plans for every scenario, safe houses and hidden accounts and arrangements with people who could spirit Paolo away if enemies ever got close enough. His wife had simply done the same thing using resources and connections he'd never known existed. The parallel was perfect, which somehow made it worse. The silent woman who'd guided him here stepped forward, pulling a small leather journal from her pocket and offering it to Domenico with both hands. He took it automatically, recognizing his wife's handwriting on the cover, Paolo's name written in the careful script she'd used for things that mattered. The pages inside contained instructions, locations, contacts within this hidden community, detailed maps of forest trails, and dozens of pressed flowers with notes about their uses. The final entry was dated 2 days before her death, her handwriting shakier but still legible. If Domenico ever finds his way here, please help him understand I did this from love, not distrust. Teach him what I couldn't, that there are sanctuaries beyond walls and guards, that Paolo deserves to know both his worlds." The shepherd suddenly stood, ears pricked toward the valley's entrance where the bramble tunnel provided access. Its body went rigid with alert tension that had everyone in the settlement turning to look. The elderly woman's expression shifted from gentle wisdom to sharp concern. "Someone followed you," she said simply, and Domenico's blood turned to ice as male voices echoed from beyond the hidden entrance. His own security team, tracking him through the forest, about to discover a secret his wife had died protecting. Domenico's hand moved to his weapon by pure instinct, but the elderly woman caught his wrist with surprising strength. Her weathered fingers pressed against his pulse point with deliberate pressure, communicating urgency without words. The settlement erupted into choreographed chaos. Children disappeared into cabins. Adults moved with practiced efficiency toward what appeared to be predetermined positions, and the shepherd positioned itself between Paolo and the tunnel entrance, with hackles raised. "Your men cannot find this place," the elderly woman whispered fiercely, her grip tightening. 50 years of secrecy ends if you let them penetrate our defenses. Your wife trusted you would understand this boundary." The accusation in her tone struck deep. She was testing whether he valued his need for control over honoring his wife's final wishes. Paolo watched with wide eyes that held more awareness than any 6-year-old should possess, measuring his father against invisible standards. The voices grew closer, Marco's distinctive baritone cutting through forest sounds as he called Domenico's name. They'd tracked him through the woods using methods Domenico himself had taught them, following broken branches and disturbed undergrowth with the persistence of trained hunters. The silent woman who'd guided him here moved swiftly to the tunnel entrance, pulling aside what appeared to be solid brambles to reveal carefully woven branches that could be repositioned to disguise the opening completely. Her movements held the fluid grace of someone who'd performed this concealment countless times. "Tell them you're searching alone, that you need solitude," the elderly woman commanded, releasing Domenico's wrist. "Send them back to the estate. Prove you can choose your son's safety over your need for armed protection." The challenge was explicit. Demonstrate that he trusted these strangers more than his own men, that he could operate without the violent infrastructure he'd spent years building. Paolo's expression wavered between hope and doubt, waiting to see which version of his father would emerge. Domenico moved toward the tunnel before conscious thought could override instinct, crawling back through thorns that tore at already damaged clothing. He emerged on the other side as Marco and 3 other security personnel crashed through the undergrowth, weapons drawn and faces tight with concern. They'd been searching for over 4 hours, imagining their employer ambushed or worse. Their relief at finding him alive quickly transformed to confusion at his disheveled appearance and the fierce intensity radiating from his posture. "Boss, thank God," Marco breathed, holstering his weapon. "When you disappeared without word, we thought—" He stopped, reading something in Domenico's expression that made him straighten defensively. "What happened? Where's the kid? Did you find anything?" The questions came rapid fire, demonstrating the loyalty that made Marco his most trusted lieutenant. Yet that loyalty now felt like chains threatening to drag his wife's secrets into daylight they were never meant to see. "I need you to return to the estate," Domenico said, forcing his voice into the authoritative tone that had commanded respect for years. "I'm following a lead that requires I continue alone. Private matter, related to my wife's past. You understand." The lie tasted bitter, but truth would bring consequences he couldn't yet calculate. Marco's eyes narrowed with suspicion, born from years reading deception in others, recognizing the signs even in his employer. "With respect, boss, you look like you've been through a war," Marco countered, gesturing at torn clothing and bleeding scratches. "Whatever you're following could be trap. Let us secure the area first, establish perimeter, then—" His tactical suggestions were perfectly reasonable, exactly what Domenico would have ordered in any other situation. But this wasn't about logic or security protocols. It was about honoring a dead woman's trust and protecting a secret that predated his involvement. "That's an order, not a request," Domenico cut him off, allowing cold authority to ice his tone. "Take the men back. Tell the household staff I'll return when I've found what I'm looking for. No one follows me. No one searches these woods. Clear?" The finality in his voice left no room for negotiation, though Marco's jaw tightened with barely suppressed frustration. The other men shifted uncomfortably, caught between duty to protect and obligation to obey. Marco held his gaze for 3 long seconds, engaging in a silent battle of wills they'd never had before. Finally, he nodded once, sharply. Your call, boss. But if you're not back by nightfall, I'm bringing every man we have into these woods. Understood? It was as close to defiance as Marco had ever come, demonstrating the genuine concern that made him more than just hired muscle. Domenico accepted the compromise with a slight dip of his chin, watching as his security team retreated through the forest with obvious reluctance. He waited until their voices faded completely before turning back to the concealed tunnel, finding the silent woman already pulling aside the camouflage to grant him re-entry. Her eyes held approval mixed with something else. Curiosity, perhaps, about a man from her grandmother's stories who'd just chosen secrecy over his established power structure. The shepherd waited on the other side, tail wagging slightly, as though congratulating Domenico on passing some crucial test. The settlement had returned to apparent normalcy by the time he emerged into the hidden valley, though Domenico noticed adults positioned strategically where they could respond to threats while maintaining facades of mundane activity. The elderly woman stood beside Paolo, one weathered hand resting on his shoulder in a gesture of protection that suggested she'd claim the boy as her own, if Domenico proved unworthy. That quiet defiance would have enraged him days ago. Now it only highlighted how little control he actually possessed. You chose well, the elderly woman acknowledged, her stern expression softening marginally. Your wife believed you capable of growth beyond violence. Today you offered evidence supporting that faith. She released Paolo, who immediately ran to Domenico with the uncomplicated affection of childhood, temporarily overriding complicated circumstances. Domenico caught his son, holding him with desperate intensity, while trying not to crush small ribs against his chest. I was so scared, he whispered into Paolo's hair, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and pine that replaced his son's usual expensive shampoo. 3 days thinking I'd lost you like I lost your mother. Don't ever. His voice broke before he could finish the command, and Paolo's small arms tightened around his neck. The shepherd approached and sat beside them, its presence somehow comforting, despite the animal's role in orchestrating this entire revelation. The silent woman touched his shoulder gently, drawing Domenico's attention to her concerned expression. She gestured toward one of the larger cabins, then mimicked drinking from a cup and eating, practical concerns he'd ignored during adrenaline's reign. His body suddenly registered exhaustion, hunger, the dozen ways he'd punished himself during 72 hours of sleepless searching. Paolo pulled back, looking at his father with worry that mirrored the adult faces surrounding them. You should rest, Papa, Paolo said softly. They have food, real food from the gardens, and Iris makes tea that Mama used to love. The casual mention of his wife, the revelation that Paolo had been here before and knew these people by name, drove home how much of their lives had existed outside his awareness. The silent woman, Iris, apparently, nodded encouragingly, gesturing again toward the cabin with patient insistence. Domenico allowed himself to be guided toward shelter, legs trembling with delayed shock and physical depletion. The cabin's interior was simple, but immaculately maintained, with hand-hewn furniture and windows that allowed forest light to fill the space with gentle warmth. Herbs hung drying from ceiling beams, filling the air with scents that triggered unexpected memories of his wife's skin after her mysterious disappearing acts into these woods. Iris moved efficiently around a wood stove, preparing food with the confident movements of someone completely comfortable in their environment. The tea Iris placed before him steamed with fragrance Domenico recognized from his wife's morning ritual. The blend she'd always claimed was imported from specialty shops, but clearly came from this hidden valley. He wrapped both hands around the ceramic mug, feeling warmth seep into fingers that had been numb since discovering Paolo's empty bed 3 mornings ago. The first sip triggered sense memory so powerful that grief crashed over him fresh. She'd been drinking this valley's essence every morning of their marriage, maintaining connection to roots she'd never admitted existed. Paolo sat beside him on the rough-hewn bench, small body pressed against his side with the clingy affection that only emerged when his son felt genuinely vulnerable. The boy picked at homemade bread slathered with butter that tasted like it had come directly from a churn, his eyes tracking Iris as she moved silently around the cabin. There was familiarity in that observation, suggesting Paolo had spent significant time here learning rhythms and patterns Domenico had never suspected. Iris can't talk, Paolo explained unnecessarily, his voice quiet with respect rather than pity. But she understands everything, and she knows sign language. Mama was teaching me before she got too sick to remember the signs. The revelation twisted something in Domenico's chest. His wife preparing their son for communication with people he'd never been introduced to, building bridges to a world she'd kept deliberately hidden. Paolo demonstrated a simple sign, and Iris responded with a smile that transformed her serious features into something luminous. The elderly woman entered without knocking, moving with the presumption of someone who owned space regardless of who currently occupied it. She carried more photographs, these ones showing recent years rather than decades past. Domenico's hand shook as he accepted them, recognizing his wife in image after image, visiting this settlement during what he'd believed were shopping trips or spa days, teaching children in the valley's center, working alongside others to repair cabin roofs and tend gardens. Her face in these photographs held a contentment he'd rarely seen during their life together. She came here every few weeks, more frequently during the last year, the elderly woman explained, settling into a chair across from them, initially to maintain connection to her heritage, later to prepare Paolo for the possibility he might need refuge. She brought supplies, medical knowledge from the city, news about development threats to the surrounding forest. In exchange, we taught her the old ways: plant medicine, sustainable living, how to exist without leaving traces your world could follow. Domenico forced himself to study each photograph with detective's attention, cataloging evidence of his wife's double life. There she was, teaching a teenage girl to identify medicinal herbs. There she stood with chainsaw in hand, helping clear fallen trees after a storm. There she sat in a circle of elders, notebook open, recording knowledge they wanted preserved. In every image, she looked vibrantly alive in ways his expensive gifts and protected mansion had never achieved. Why hide it? The question emerged harsh, with hurt he couldn't fully suppress. If this place made her happy, why not bring me here? Why maintain the secrecy even when she was dying? His voice cracked on the last word, grief and betrayal tangling into emotional knots he couldn't untie. The elderly woman regarded him with expression that mixed sympathy and exasperation, as though explaining something obvious to a stubborn child. You were a dangerous man, Mr. Caruso. Are still dangerous, if we're being honest. My granddaughter loved you deeply, but love doesn't eliminate reality. Every person you've threatened, every deal you've enforced with violence, every enemy you've made in building your empire, all of that creates ripples that touch everything you care about. She couldn't risk leading your world to ours. The assessment was delivered without judgment, simple recitation of facts that Domenico couldn't refute without lying to himself. Iris approached with a basket of fresh vegetables, setting them on the table before signing something elaborate to the elderly woman. Paolo watched the exchange with partial understanding, catching enough meaning to translate for his father. She says the afternoon work groups are starting. Garden team needs extra hands preparing beds for spring planting. She's asking if we want to help. The casual invitation felt surreal. A Mafia boss being invited to do manual agricultural labor by people who lived completely outside his sphere of influence. The elderly woman stood with the creaking joints of advanced age, but her eyes remained sharp with assessing intelligence. You can stay here recovering, or you can learn something about the world your son will need to navigate. Your wife believed he should understand both sides of his heritage, your world's power and this valley's sustainability. The choice has always been yours to make, though you weren't aware you were making it. She headed toward the door, pausing to look back with expectation clear in her posture. Domenico looked at Paolo, finding his son's face bright with hope that maybe, just maybe, his father would choose participation over observation. The boy had spent 3 days here, fully engaged with community life, probably happier than Domenico had seen him since before his mother's death. That simple fact was more devastating than any enemy's betrayal. He'd provided everything money could buy except the thing Paolo actually needed. The shepherd appeared in the doorway as though summoned, its presence somehow tipping the scales toward a decision that terrified every self-protective instinct Domenico possessed. "All right," he heard himself say, standing on legs that protested the movement. "Show me these gardens. Show me what made her choose thorns and dirt over Italian marble." The words emerged bitter but sincere, and Paolo's resulting smile was worth every scratch he'd suffered crawling through brambles. Iris signed something that made the elderly woman chuckle darkly, though neither offered translation. The shepherd led the way back into afternoon sunlight that seemed brighter than it had any right to be. The gardens occupied the valley's southern exposure, terraced into hillside with engineering sophistication that spoke of generations perfecting the technique. Raised beds built from riverstone contained soil so dark and rich it looked almost black, ready to receive seeds that would feed the community through another year. Men and women worked together with easy coordination, some turning earth with hand tools, while others spread compost with the efficiency of long practice. Children carried water from a nearby stream, their laughter mixing with adult conversation to create atmosphere of productive contentment. People paused in their work as Domenico approached, curiosity replacing the cautious distance they'd maintained during his arrival. He realized suddenly that they knew who he was, not just Paolo's father, but the criminal whose reputation preceded him into any room he entered. Yet no fear showed in their faces, only the same assessing quality he'd seen in the elderly woman's eyes. They were measuring him against his wife's descriptions, determining whether he deserved the trust she'd apparently requested they extend. Iris handed him a shovel with expression that suggested she expected him to have no idea how to use it. The assumption rankled despite being partially accurate. Domenico had spent 20 years building an empire with threats and negotiations, not physical labor. But his grandfather had been a farmer before immigrating, and some genetic memory insisted he could figure out the basics. He drove the blade into soil with more force than necessary, feeling his back immediately protest the unfamiliar motion. Paolo giggled at his awkward technique, earning a mock glare that made his son laugh harder. The work was simultaneously monotonous and meditative, each shovelful of earth turned requiring focus that left no room for the thoughts that usually consumed him. Sweat soaked through his shirt within 20 minutes, muscles burning from exertion his gym workouts had never prepared him for. Iris worked beside him with fluid efficiency, her silence somehow more companionable than conversation would have been. She corrected his grip with gentle touches, demonstrated proper posture to save his back, communicated entire lessons through gesture and patient example. 2 hours passed like minutes and eternities simultaneously, the sun tracking across the sky, while Domenico discovered capabilities he'd never known existed beneath his expensive suits. His hands blistered despite gloves someone had thoughtfully provided, and dirt worked its way under his fingernails in ways his manicurist would despair over. But something loosened in his chest with each turned shovel, some tension he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it wasn't natural. Paolo worked in the Children's Water Brigade, his laughter carrying across the garden with crystalline purity that made everything worthwhile. Evening arrived with the gradual dimming that only happened in places without artificial light pollution, the sky transforming through shades of amber and rose that seemed painted specifically for this hidden valley. Work ceased by unspoken agreement, tools cleaned and stored with the reverence of items that must last indefinitely. Domenico's entire body ached with the good pain of physical exhaustion, rather than the corroding stress that usually plagued him. His hands were filthy, his clothes ruined beyond any tailor's salvation, and he felt more present in his skin than he had since his wife's funeral. The community gathered for dinner around a central fire pit, the meal prepared collectively from ingredients everyone had contributed to growing or gathering. Long tables were set with mismatched dishes and cups, the lack of uniformity somehow adding to rather than detracting from the atmosphere. Children darted between adults with the confidence of being universally welcomed, while the shepherd moved through the crowd receiving attention from everyone it passed. Paolo stayed close to Domenico, but no longer clung, his comfort level suggesting this place felt like home in ways their mansion never had. Iris appeared beside Domenico with a bowl of stew that smelled like heaven and tasted even better, the flavors complex and satisfying in ways his chef's elaborate creations never achieved. She signed something, and the elderly woman translated from her position across the fire. "She wants you to know your wife's favorite spot was the bench beneath the ancient cedar at the valley's edge. She'd sit there for hours writing in her journal, working through thoughts she couldn't share anywhere else. The information was offered as gift, an invitation to understand the woman he'd loved, but apparently never fully known." After dinner, Domenico followed Iris's directions to find the cedar she'd mentioned, an enormous tree that must have been centuries old judging by its massive trunk. The bench beneath it was simple but well-maintained, positioned to overlook the valley below, while remaining sheltered by sweeping branches. Moonlight filtered through needles to create patterns on weathered wood, where his wife had apparently spent countless hours seeking peace. He sat heavily, his battered body grateful for rest, and pulled her journal from his jacket pocket where it had remained throughout the day's labor. The entries spanned their entire marriage, beginning with cautious hope that maybe she could build a life bridging two worlds. Early pages bubbled with love for Domenico, mixed with concern about his business dealings, her elegant handwriting revealing internal struggles she'd never voiced aloud. She'd written about finding him fundamentally good beneath the violence his circumstances required, believing she could help him see alternatives to the path his father had set him on. The optimism was heartbreaking in retrospect, knowing how things ultimately ended. Middle entries grew darker as she documented, realizing that Domenico wasn't interested in changing, that he'd chosen his empire over the values she'd hoped they'd share. She'd written about their arguments, ones he barely remembered, where she'd questioned the necessity of certain deals, or the wisdom of particular alliances. His dismissals of her concerns were recorded in hurt phrases that made his chest tighten with belated regret. Yet alongside the pain, she'd written about Paolo's birth rekindling hope that maybe becoming a father would transform Domenico in ways marriage hadn't. The final year's entries were devastating, chronicling her diagnosis and treatment, while simultaneously detailing her desperate efforts to prepare Paolo for life without her. She'd written about bringing their son to the valley, teaching him the paths and people who could provide sanctuary if Domenico's world became too dangerous. Her fear wasn't that he'd intentionally harm Paolo, but that the violence inherent in his lifestyle would eventually consume their son through proximity. Each entry hammered home the reality that she'd died believing Domenico incapable of choosing anything beyond the power and control he'd spent years accumulating. The last entry stopped his breath entirely. If Domenico ever finds this journal, if the shepherd successfully brings him here after I'm gone, maybe there's hope. I've loved him through every terrible choice, every moral compromise, every moment he chose empire over ethics, but I can't love him into changing. That choice has to be his. All I can do is create a path for Paolo to escape if necessary, and trust that maybe, someday, Domenico will understand why I had to. The words blurred as tears Domenico had been suppressing for 3 days finally broke through his carefully maintained control. Iris found him there sometime later, sitting in darkness with his wife's journal clutched against his chest, like it could somehow bring her back. The silent woman carried a lantern that cast gentle light across his devastated expression, without judgment or pity. She settled onto the bench beside him, maintaining respectful distance while making her supportive presence clear. They sat in silence for long minutes, Domenico's grief finally given space to breathe beyond the constant demands of appearing strong for employees and enemies alike. Eventually, Iris pulled out a small notebook, writing quickly before showing him the page. She spoke of you often during the last months. Despite everything, she never stopped believing you had capacity for choosing differently. She said you'd protected her with the same fierceness you'd later protect Paolo, that the violence in you came from love turned defensive rather than inherent cruelty. She thought grief might crack you open enough to see beyond what your father taught you to value. The words were offered not as absolution, but as evidence that his wife had understood him better than he'd understood himself. Domenico looked toward the valley where firelight still flickered, and voices carried on night air with the contentment of people who'd found sustainable ways to exist. Paolo was down there somewhere, probably being told stories or learning songs, absorbing community life with the adaptability of childhood. His son deserved better than being collateral damage in battles Domenico had chosen to fight, better than living behind walls and armed guards, because his father couldn't imagine alternative ways of wielding influence. His wife had tried to tell him this for years, but he'd been too consumed by empire building to listen. "I don't know how to be anything except what I am," he said aloud, not sure if he was speaking to Iris, or his wife's memory, or the forest itself. "The people I've hurt, the deals I've made, the reputation I've built. All of that exists regardless of whether I want to change. There's no walking away clean from the life I've chosen." The admission felt like confession, acknowledging reality he'd spent years justifying as necessary, rather than examining as deliberate choices he'd made repeatedly. Iris wrote again, her pen moving with confident speed. "Your wife didn't expect you to become someone different. She hoped you'd choose to apply your capabilities differently. You've built an empire through force and fear. Imagine what you could build with those same skills directed toward protecting things that matter. This valley has survived 50 years through careful legal navigation and strategic obscurity. We could use someone with your understanding of power structures to ensure we survive 50 more." The proposition was presented as simple fact rather than manipulation, inviting him to consider alternatives he'd never imagined possible. The idea settled into his consciousness like a seed finding fertile soil. His entire adult life had been oriented around accumulating power for its own sake, proving he could exceed his father's achievements through superior ruthlessness. But what if that same strategic intelligence could be repurposed toward preservation, rather than exploitation? The valley's existence depended on remaining hidden from developers and government entities that would either destroy it or regulate it into something unrecognizable. That was a problem his particular skill set could actually solve. My enemies would use this place against me if they knew it existed, Domenico said slowly, working through implications. Any known vulnerability becomes a target. Me being here, Paolo being here, creates risk for everyone. The objection was practical rather than dismissive, his mind already cataloging potential threats and necessary precautions. Iris nodded acknowledgement, but wrote something that suggested she'd anticipated this concern and had thoughts about how to address it. Your wife spent a year establishing legal protections, trusts and conservation easements that make this land untouchable regardless of who owns the surrounding property. She used her own name, not yours, specifically to avoid connecting it to your reputation. What we need now is someone who understands how enemies think, who can anticipate threats and neutralize them before they materialize. Someone whose own survival depends on this valley's secrecy remaining intact. Iris handed him the notebook, letting him absorb her words at his own pace. Domenico read the paragraph 3 times, feeling the logic settle around him like carefully woven net. His wife had been preparing for this possibility, creating legal infrastructure that could protect her sanctuary even after her death. But legal documents only worked when no one had reason to examine them closely or challenge them aggressively. That's where his understanding of violence and intimidation became useful, not to threaten the valley, but to ensure anyone who might threaten it understood the consequences of such actions. The irony of using criminal skills to protect something innocent from corruption wasn't lost on him. I'd have to maintain appearances in my other life, he said, thinking through logistics. Can't just disappear without triggering succession wars that would make my enemies bolder, but I could create distance, delegate more, extract myself gradually from direct operations, make it look like grief is making me less sharp, less interested in maintaining control. Let ambitious underlings think they're gaining ground while I'm actually redirecting my attention here. The strategy formed as he spoke, his tactical mind engaging with challenges that felt meaningful rather than merely profitable. Iris smiled and wrote one final sentence before standing to leave him with his thoughts. Your wife always said you were brilliant at solving problems when you cared about the solution, rather than just winning. Welcome to problems that actually matter. She left the lantern and retreated toward the cabins, her footsteps silent on the forest floor. The shepherd appeared from somewhere in the darkness, settling at Domenico's feet, with the patient presence that suggested it would wait as long as necessary for him to finish processing the evening's revelations. Dawn arrived with mist clinging to the valley floor like tangible secrets, transforming the settlement into something from fairy tales rather than modern reality. Domenico had spent the night in one of the guest cabins, sleeping more deeply than he had since his wife's death, despite the unfamiliar sounds of forest life surrounding him. He woke to find Paolo already dressed, and eager to show his father the morning routines that governed community life here. The breakfast preparation was communal, everyone contributing something to tables that filled with fresh bread, preserves made from last summer's berries, eggs collected from chickens scratching in a nearby coop. Domenico found himself assigned to coffee duty, grinding beans by hand in a manual grinder that required actual physical effort. The resulting brew was stronger and more flavorful than anything his expensive espresso machine produced. The simple act of creation, adding satisfaction that push-button convenience never achieved. Iris appeared with the shepherd at her side, both looking refreshed and purposeful in morning light that made the valley seem almost luminous. She handed Domenico a thermos of the coffee he'd helped prepare, along with a knowing smile that suggested she understood how foreign all of this felt to someone accustomed to servants and separation from food's origins. Paolo chattered excitedly about the day's planned activities, helping repair a cabin roof damaged during winter storms, learning to identify early spring plants emerging from still cold ground. The elderly woman materialized from her cabin wrapped in a shawl against morning chill, her eyes finding Domenico with the penetrating assessment that seemed to be her default expression. She gestured for him to follow, leading him away from the breakfast gathering toward the valley's northern edge, where the terrain grew rockier and less cultivated. They climbed in silence until reaching an outcropping that provided panoramic views of the entire hidden settlement below, and the vast forest stretching beyond in all directions. Your wife stood here on her final visit, the elderly woman said without preamble. She was too weak to make the climb easily, but she insisted, said she needed to see it all one last time, to hold it in her memory for whatever came next. Her voice carried the weight of grief that hadn't fully processed, losing a granddaughter decades too soon. She made me promise that if you ever found your way here, I would show you this exact view and tell you something specific. Domenico's throat tightened, bracing himself for whatever message his wife had left for a future she wouldn't live to see. The old woman continued, her gaze fixed on the valley below rather than his face. She said to tell you that loving you was the bravest thing she'd ever done, but that you made it worth every moment of fear, that she forgave you for choosing power over peace, because she understood you were trying to protect what you loved the only way you'd been taught, but that Paolo deserved better than inheriting your limitations. The words landed like physical blows, each one precisely aimed at the places Domenico had spent years armoring against exactly this kind of emotional vulnerability. His wife's forgiveness somehow hurt worse than condemnation would have, the grace of it highlighting how little he'd done to deserve such generosity of spirit. Paolo deserved better. That truth was inescapable, undeniable, and completely within Domenico's power to address if he could find courage his wife had believed existed beneath his carefully constructed defenses. What exactly did she expect me to do? The question emerged raw, stripped of the command and certainty he usually projected. Walk away from everything I've built. Pretend 20 years of decisions can be erased by suddenly developing a conscience? Even as he spoke, Domenico recognized the defensiveness for what it was. Fear masquerading as practical objection. Terror of unknown possibilities dressed up as reasonable skepticism. The elderly woman turned to face him fully, her weathered features holding something almost like compassion. She expected you to do exactly what you're doing right now, questioning whether the path you've walked is the only one available to you. Your wife didn't believe in overnight transformations or dramatic conversions. She believed in gradual evolution, choices made differently one day at a time until they accumulated into genuine change. She hoped finding this place would plant seeds that might eventually grow into something sustaining. Before Domenico could formulate a response, shouting erupted from the valley below. Both he and the elderly woman turned to see unusual commotion near the settlement's center. People gathering in a way that suggested emergency rather than celebration. The shepherd's distant barking carried urgency that sent ice through Domenico's veins. Something was wrong, and every protective instinct he possessed screamed that it involved Paolo. He was running down the slope before conscious thought engaged, the elderly woman's calls for caution lost behind him as gravity and fear propelled him forward. He crashed through the gathering crowd to find Paolo standing frozen beside Iris, both of them staring at a man Domenico recognized with sickening immediacy. Rico Battaglia stood at the valley's entrance with 3 armed associates, their weapons drawn but not yet aimed at specific targets. Rico was a mid-level enforcer for the Gallo family, one of Domenico's primary rivals, and his presence here meant only one thing. Somehow, impossibly, someone had followed the trail to this hidden sanctuary. The expression on Rico's face mixed triumph with confusion, clearly not having expected to find what he'd stumbled upon. Well, Rico called out, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent valley. Domenico Caruso disappeared for 2 days, and here he is playing wilderness explorer with a bunch of tree huggers. The boys back home were worried you'd been taken out, but looks like you've just been slumming it. Although I gotta say, boss, this is quite the secret you've been keeping. His tone was conversational, but the threat was explicit. He'd found something Domenico desperately needed to remain hidden, and they both understood the leverage that knowledge represented. Domenico's hand moved toward his concealed weapon, before strategic thinking overrode reactive violence. Shooting Rico would only confirm there was something here worth protecting, and would bring more attention when he inevitably didn't report back. The shepherd positioned itself between the armed men and Paolo, hackles raised and teeth bared in warning that suggested it would tear throats out if they moved toward the boy. Iris stood beside his son with protective intensity that communicated she'd die before letting harm reach him, her silence somehow more threatening than any verbal challenge. Rico, Domenico said, forcing his voice into casual authority, despite the panic threatening to overwhelm tactical calculation. You've got 15 seconds to explain how you found me, and why you thought tracking me without permission was a good career move. The implicit threat hung in morning air. Rico had violated protocols by following a superior without orders, stepping outside established hierarchies in ways that could justify severe consequences. But they both knew the real question was what happened next, how this situation resolved, without destroying everything Domenico's wife had built to protect. Rico's confidence wavered slightly, recognition that he'd perhaps miscalculated by coming here with hostile energy rather than feigned concern. Marco sent word you'd disappeared into the woods alone, seemed worried. I was in the area on other business and figured I'd check that you weren't in trouble. Guess I was right to be concerned. Finding you out here with your kid and a bunch of strangers who seem real interested in staying off the grid. Makes a man wonder what other secrets you've been keeping from the families who depend on your leadership. The implication was clear. Rico would leverage this discovery to advance his position within the Gallo organization, possibly using it to undermine Domenico's authority or force concessions in ongoing territorial negotiations. The settlement's residents watched this confrontation with varying degrees of alarm, clearly understanding they were witnessing their secrecy being compromised by exactly the kind of violence their isolation was meant to avoid. Paolo's face had gone pale, his small hand clutched in Iris's, understanding enough to know his father's world had just invaded his mother's sanctuary in catastrophic fashion. Domenico's mind raced through options, each one carrying consequences that rippled outward in unacceptable directions. He could kill Rico and his men, but their bodies would trigger investigations that would bring authorities exactly where they couldn't come. He could attempt bribery, but that would confirm there was something valuable to protect, and would only delay inevitable exposure. He could threaten retaliation, but Rico had clearly calculated those risks before coming here, and deemed the potential reward worth gambling his life on. The tactical impossibility of the situation was its own form of trap. Then Iris did something completely unexpected. She stepped forward with deliberate calm and began signing in rapid, complex gestures that none of the armed men could interpret, but that commanded attention through sheer confidence. The elderly woman moved to translate, her voice steady despite the weapons pointed in her general direction. This woman says you've stumbled onto a conservation project that's been operating under federal protection for 5 years. Environmental monitoring station tracking endangered species migration patterns. She says we have documentation from Fish and Wildlife Services, permits from Forest Service, and regularly filed reports with multiple government agencies. Nothing secret or illegal happening here. The lie was delivered with such conviction that even Domenico almost believed it. Rico's expression shifted from triumphant to uncertain, the presence of governmental oversight changing calculations significantly. Nobody wanted attention from federal agencies, whose investigations were harder to control than local police. Iris continued signing, and the elderly woman kept translating. She says Mr. Caruso's late wife was a volunteer with the project before she died, and he brought his son here to connect with her memory. If you'd like to verify our permits, she can provide documentation and contact information for our government liaisons, though she wonders why armed men are threatening environmental scientists on federal land. The reversal was masterful, transforming the settlement from vulnerable secret into bureaucratically protected entity that posed risk to anyone threatening it. Rico exchanged glances with his associates, clearly recalibrating. Getting crosswise with environmental agencies meant complications even his bosses would avoid if possible. The elderly woman pressed the advantage, her tone shifting from defensive to mildly annoyed. We appreciate Mr. Caruso's concern for his employees' well-being, but perhaps next time a simple phone call would be less disruptive to sensitive wildlife observation we're conducting. Several bird species nest in this area during spring migration. Your presence is likely disturbing them considerably. Rico lowered his weapons slowly, pride wrestling with practical assessment of whether this was worth pursuing. Yeah, well, environmental stuff isn't really my area. Just wanted to make sure the boss was safe. You know how it is. Glad everything's legitimate here. The backpedaling was clumsy but face-saving, allowing him to retreat without admitting he'd been outmaneuvered. We'll head back. Let Marco know you're fine and just doing some personal stuff. No need to mention the bird watching or whatever to anyone else. I'm sure you value your privacy. The implied threat was obvious. Rico would keep quiet about the settlement's existence in exchange for unspecified future considerations, leveraging his knowledge as insurance policy. Domenico recognized the play because he'd used similar tactics countless times, building power through accumulated secrets that could be deployed strategically. But accepting that arrangement meant permanently ceding leverage to someone who could expose this place whenever it suited his ambitions, leaving Paolo's sanctuary vulnerable to whims of a man whose loyalty was purchasable by whoever offered the best price. Actually, Rico, I think we need to talk about this somewhere private, Domenico said, his tone shifting into the cold authority that had built his reputation. Paolo, stay with Iris. Everyone else, continue with your day. Nothing to see here. The command was obeyed immediately by the settlement's residents, who melted away with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to avoiding unwanted attention. Rico's associates shifted nervously, recognizing the change in atmosphere, but unable to identify exactly what had triggered their instincts toward flight. Domenico led Rico away from the valley's center toward a section of forest dense enough to muffle sound, but open enough that treachery would be difficult to accomplish undetected. The shepherd followed at distance, maintaining watch without interfering. Once they were sufficiently isolated, Domenico turned to face Rico with expression that made the other man's hand drift toward his holstered weapon. "Here's how this is going to work," Domenico said quietly. "You're going to forget you ever found this place. You're going to tell Marco I was visiting my late wife's conservation project and got emotional about her memory. You're going to file this away as personal tragedy rather than exploitable intelligence." Rico's laugh was nervous rather than genuine. "And why would I do that when I'm sitting on information that the gallows would pay handsomely for? No offense, boss, but your family connections and grief don't outweigh career advancement." The defiance was expected, even necessary for what came next. Domenico had spent 20 years reading men like Rico, understanding exactly which pressure points would transform bravado into compliance, without requiring violence that would echo back destructively. "Because I'm going to give you something better," Domenico continued, pulling out his phone and scrolling to encrypted files he'd never planned to use. "I've got documentation of every violation the Gallo organization has committed in the past 5 years. Locations of hidden accounts, names of corrupted officials, evidence that would put your bosses away for decades and collapse their entire operation." He turned the screen to show Rico enough proof to be credible without revealing everything. "This information goes to federal prosecutors if word about this valley reaches anyone outside this forest. Your bosses go down, and everyone knows you're the reason." The color drained from Rico's face as implications crystallized. Betraying Domenico would mean destroying his own organization, making him a target for every surviving member seeking revenge. But staying quiet meant passing up leverage that could have advanced his position significantly. The calculation was brutal: certain destruction versus uncertain advancement. Domenico watched the internal struggle play across Rico's expression, with the detached interest of someone who'd forced similar choices on dozens of men over the years. "That's a lot of collateral damage just to protect some bird watchers," Rico said weakly, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. "Makes a man wonder what's really going on out here that you'd burn everything to keep it quiet." The implied question hung between them. What was valuable enough to justify mutually assured destruction as protection strategy? Domenico met his gaze without flinching, allowing genuine emotion to show through his usual mask of calculated control. "It's not about what's here," Domenico said quietly. "It's about honoring my wife's dying wish that our son have somewhere safe from the life I've built. This valley is Paolo's inheritance from his mother. Clean, protected, untouched by the corruption we swim in daily. You have children, Rico. You understand what it means to want something better for them than what we've become." The appeal to paternal instinct was calculated, but also sincere, drawing on the one emotional vulnerability most men in their world couldn't completely armor against. Rico's jaw tightened. Recognition that Domenico had identified and targeted his pressure point with surgical precision. He did have kids, 3 daughters he sent to private schools and protected from any knowledge of how he actually earned their tuition. The parallel was uncomfortable, highlighting hypocrisy of men who dealt violence while desperately trying to shield their children from its consequences. After a long moment, Rico nodded once, sharply. "All right, I was never here. This place doesn't exist, and your personal grief is your own business. But you owe me, Caruso. Someday I'm going to call that in, and you're going to answer." The compromise was acceptable. A future obligation was manageable compared to immediate exposure. Domenico extended his hand, sealing the agreement with physical gesture that carried weight in their world. "Fair enough. And Rico, if this valley's existence somehow becomes public knowledge, I'll know exactly where it originated. The consequences will be thorough, creative, and permanent. We clear?" The threat was delivered without heat, simple statement of fact that required no embellishment. Rico shook his hand with grip that communicated he understood perfectly, then retreated toward where his associates waited with visible relief. Domenico watched them disappear through the forest before allowing his legs to give out, sitting heavily on a fallen log as delayed reaction crashed through his system. His hands shook with adrenaline depletion, and his heart hammered against ribs that suddenly felt too tight. That confrontation had been diplomatic knife fight conducted with smiles and measured words, but no less dangerous than physical violence would have been. One miscalculation and everything would have unraveled. The settlement exposed, his son's sanctuary destroyed, his wife's final gift to Paolo obliterated by the very world she'd tried to protect him from. The shepherd approached and pushed its massive head under Domenico's hand, offering wordless comfort that somehow helped ground him back in the present moment. The animal's eyes held that uncanny intelligence, seeming to understand exactly what had just transpired, and offering approval for choices made. Domenico buried his fingers in thick fur, breathing deeply until his pulse returned to something approaching normal. His wife had trained this animal, had prepared it to guide and protect Paolo, had embedded her love into something that survived beyond death. The thought was both comforting and devastating. When Domenico finally returned to the valley's center, he found Iris waiting with expression that mixed concern and a different emotion he couldn't immediately identify. She signed something elaborate, her movements graceful and expressive in ways that transcended simple communication. The elderly woman appeared to translate, but Domenico found he was beginning to understand some of Iris's meaning directly. Fluency born from watching her hands shape words with such precision that language barriers became negotiable. She says you handled that with more wisdom than violence, which suggests your wife's faith in you wasn't misplaced, the elderly woman conveyed. She also says that protecting this place will require ongoing vigilance, that Rico will honor his word only as long as doing so serves his interests. She's offering to teach you the valley's defenses, trails that lead nowhere, sensor systems that detect intrusion, communication networks that don't rely on technology your enemies can track. Says your wife began learning these things before she died, and that knowledge should pass to someone equally committed to preservation. The offer was extended through translator but originated from Iris herself, whose dark eyes held intensity that communicated this wasn't casual invitation. She was proposing to share secrets the valley had protected for generations, to trust him with information that represented their ultimate security. The significance wasn't lost on Domenico. This was acceptance, recognition that he'd proven himself worthy of inclusion in the community his wife had been born into. More than that, Iris's expression held something personal, an acknowledgement of connection that had formed through shared purpose and unspoken understanding. Over the following days, Iris became his guide into aspects of valley life that visitors never saw. She showed him hidden observation posts where sentries monitored approaches without being detected. She explained the signal system that used specific bird calls to communicate warnings across distances. She taught him which plants could be used to obscure trails, and which created natural barriers that channeled potential intruders into observable corridors. Each lesson was conducted in near silence, their communication evolving into shorthand of gesture and expression that required fewer words than conversation with people he'd known for years. Evenings found them sitting by the fire after Paolo had been put to bed, Iris writing in her notebook, while Domenico studied maps and documentation his wife had compiled. Sometimes the elderly woman joined them, adding context to legal structures and historical decisions that had shaped the valley's current protections. But increasingly, she left them alone, her knowing glances suggesting she recognized something developing between them that didn't require, and might be hindered by, external interference. The shepherd sprawled between them like blessing, its presence somehow sanctioning whatever was growing in the spaces their words didn't fill. Domenico found himself watching Iris with attention that transcended strategic interest, noticing how firelight caught the elegant line of her throat when she tilted her head while writing. Her silence had stopped feeling like limitation, and started registering as form of communication more honest than the manipulative words he'd spent years perfecting. She spoke through the meals she prepared with care, through the patient way she corrected his mistakes learning valley protocols, through the soft expression that transformed her serious features when Paolo ran to show her some discovery or accomplishment. Her entire existence was testament to different ways of being powerful. One evening, while reviewing property boundaries on survey maps his wife had marked with potential threat assessments, Iris reached across the space between them and took his hand. The gesture was simple, initiated without fanfare or dramatic build-up, but it stopped Domenico's breath completely. Her palm was rough with calluses from physical work, warm against his skin, and the contact communicated something her voice couldn't have articulated. She wasn't offering romance in the traditional sense he understood it, wasn't proposing to replace his wife's memory. She was extending partnership, suggesting they could build something new while honoring what had been lost. Domenico turned his hand to properly grasp hers, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in acknowledgement that he understood what she was offering. They sat like that until the fire burned low, not speaking because words would have been inadequate, letting the physical connection communicate what language would only diminish. The shepherd lifted its head to observe this development, then settled back with contented sigh that sounded almost like approval. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight, the forest carried on its nocturnal symphony, indifferent to human complications and connections forming beneath its canopy. The weeks that followed established new rhythms that surprised Domenico with how naturally they developed. He began splitting his time between the valley and his estate, maintaining appearances in his criminal organization while systematically extracting himself from its most violent operations. Marco noticed the changes with suspicion, but couldn't articulate exactly what was different. His boss was still present, still making decisions, but with detachment that suggested his attention had migrated elsewhere. Domenico encouraged this perception, allowing his second-in-command to assume greater responsibility, while maintaining just enough oversight to prevent catastrophic miscalculations. In the valley, he became something he'd never imagined possible, useful without being in command. Iris taught him carpentry skills for maintaining cabins, plant identification for understanding the forest's medicine cabinet, tracking techniques for monitoring wildlife movements that indicated ecosystem health. His hands, which had spent years signing documents that destroyed lives, learned to build things that lasted beyond quarterly profit reports. Paolo flourished watching his father evolve, seeing possibilities for masculinity that didn't require dominance and violence as primary expressions. The relationship with Iris deepened through shared work, rather than romantic gestures, their connection built on mutual respect and complementary capabilities. She understood loss in ways that made his grief over his wife feel less isolating, her own history containing tragedies she communicated through sad eyes rather than spoken narrative. They developed private language of glances and touches, small intimacies that acknowledged growing affection without rushing toward traditional relationship milestones. The Valley accepted their partnership with quiet approval, recognizing that Domenico's commitment to protection intensified with personal investment in what he was guarding. Spring advanced into early summer, bringing the migration patterns Iris had falsely claimed they were monitoring during Rico's intrusion. Actual bird species returned to nest in the protected valley, their presence validating the cover story in ways that felt almost like cosmic approval. Paolo helped document sightings with enthusiasm that suggested his mother's love of nature had successfully transmitted across generations. The boy had started calling Iris by name rather than formal address, his comfort with her presence evolving into something approaching familial affection. One evening, while reviewing legal documents for upcoming county planning meetings that could affect surrounding forest access, Domenico realized he'd stopped thinking about the valley as his wife's legacy and started experiencing it as his own responsibility. The shift was subtle but fundamental. He wasn't protecting this place to honor her memory anymore, but because it represented values he'd independently chosen to embrace. The distinction mattered, transforming obligation into authentic commitment that would survive beyond guilt or grief's eventual diminishment. "My father is planning to move against the gallows," Marco reported during one of their weekly check-ins at the estate. "Thinks you've gone soft since your wife died, that you're vulnerable and distracted. He's building coalition with the Brennan family to make a play for your territories." The information was delivered with conflicted loyalty. Marco was Domenico's man, but also son to one of his father's oldest associates. The warning was both professional courtesy and plea for guidance about where ultimate allegiance should fall when family structures collided with chosen bonds. Domenico absorbed the intelligence without the rage such betrayal would have triggered months earlier. His father had trained him in the business, introduced him to the families, established connections that had built his empire. But that same father had also taught him that love was weakness, that vulnerability invited exploitation, that power existed as its own justification. Paolo deserved different lessons, and Domenico had finally accepted that delivering them meant rejecting the man who'd shaped his early understanding of masculinity and success. "Let him make his move," Domenico said quietly, surprising Marco with apparent passivity. "I'm done fighting wars over territories that matter only because we've all agreed they matter. Tell your father I'll meet with him and the Brennans next week. Neutral ground, no weapons, just conversation about reorganizing arrangements that benefit everyone more than continued conflict would." The proposal was radical in their world, suggesting negotiation rather than violence, collaborative resource sharing rather than zero-sum competition. Marco's expression showed he thought grief had truly broken his boss's spirit, weakening him into diplomatic capitulation. But Domenico had different plan entirely. He would offer his father and the rival families something they couldn't obtain through violence: access to legal expertise that could protect their operations from increasing federal scrutiny, intelligence networks that identified threats before they materialized, political connections that provided advance warning of investigations and regulatory changes. In exchange, he wanted their agreement to leave specific territories undeveloped, creating buffer zones around protected lands like the Valley. He would transform from territorial warlord into specialized consultant, maintaining influence without the constant violence his wife had rightfully feared. The night before the crucial meeting, Iris found Domenico staring at maps that showed his criminal territories overlaid with conservation lands and development threats. She didn't need words to understand he was attempting something unprecedented, risking everything on belief that men who'd spent lives pursuing power through violence could be persuaded to choose different measures of success. She placed her hands on his shoulders, her touch grounding him in the present moment while his mind spiraled through contingencies and potential disasters. He pulled her down to sit beside him, needing her physical presence as anchor against the vertigo of deliberately dismantling structures he'd spent decades building. This could fail spectacularly, he admitted, speaking aloud what they both understood. My father could interpret this as weakness and move to eliminate me. The other families could see opportunity to carve up my holdings. I could lose everything I've built and endanger the valley in the process. The fears were legitimate, based on realistic assessment of men whose default response to change was violent resistance. Iris pulled out her notebook, writing with the careful precision she employed for important communications. Your wife spent her last year preparing for the possibility you might choose this path. She established fallback positions, legal documents that activate if something happens to you, financial resources hidden under names no one would think to search, contacts with environmental organizations that could mobilize public pressure if necessary. You're not alone in this, and failure doesn't mean total loss. It means trying again with different strategy. The revelation that his wife had prepared for this specific scenario was simultaneously comforting and heartbreaking. She'd believed in his capacity for evolution, even while creating contingencies for his potential failure or death. That faith demanded he actually commit to the risk, rather than hedging with half measures that maintained escape routes. Domenico pressed his forehead against Iris's shoulder, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and herbs that had become synonymous with safety and home. The shepherd curled at their feet, completing the picture of family he'd been slowly constructing from fragments of loss and hope. The meeting occurred at dawn in a warehouse Domenico's organization used for legitimate import operations, the space empty except for a single table and chairs positioned beneath industrial lighting that left no shadows for concealed threats. His father arrived flanked by the Brennan family's leadership, their expressions mixing anticipation with confusion about why they'd been invited to negotiate, rather than simply taking what they wanted. Domenico had come alone except for Marco, whose presence represented institutional memory and connection to both sides of the emerging conflict. You've called us here to surrender, Domenico's father stated without preamble, his tone mixing satisfaction with contempt. I'd say I'm disappointed, but honestly, you've been weak since that woman died. Time to step aside and let men with actual spines run things properly. The insult was designed to provoke violent response, to demonstrate that Domenico had indeed lost the cold brutality that had built his reputation. Every instinct trained into him since childhood screamed to respond with overwhelming force, to prove dominance through the language of violence they all understood. Instead, Domenico smiled with genuine amusement that confused everyone present. I'm not surrendering anything. I'm retiring from the game you're playing because I found a more interesting one, but I'm offering you something valuable before I go. Information, connections, and expertise that will make you all richer and safer than territorial warfare ever could. In exchange, I want agreements protecting specific properties from development and a clean exit that doesn't require me to destroy everything to keep you from pursuing me into retirement. The proposal hung in the warehouse's stale air, so unexpected that none of the hardened criminals knew how to respond initially. His father recovered first, leaning back in his chair with expression that suggested he thought his son had suffered complete mental breakdown. And why would we agree to anything when we can just take what you're offering and everything else you own? You've already admitted you're out. That makes you prey, not partner. The logic was sound according to their world's rules, which was precisely why Domenico had prepared for this response. Because the federal government is about to bring RICO charges against the Brennan organization, and they have evidence that will trace back to your operations as well, Father, Domenico said calmly, producing documents from sealed envelope. I know this because I've been their confidential informant for the past 6 months, feeding them information about everyone except myself. These charges disappear if you accept my terms. They proceed if I give the signal that negotiations have failed. You have 10 minutes to decide whether pride is worth spending your final years in federal prison. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by sound of papers being passed around the table, as hardened criminals confronted evidence of their own betrayal by someone they'd underestimated. Domenico's father's face had gone dangerously red, rage warring with self-preservation instinct honed through decades of survival. The Brennan leadership exchanged glances that communicated they were calculating whether killing Domenico would prevent the information from being released, or simply guarantee it. Marco had gone pale, understanding that his boss had been playing a completely different game than anyone suspected while appearing weak and grieving. "You've been working against us for months," his father finally managed, voice tight with controlled fury. "Your own family. For what? Some nature preserve where your dead wife used to volunteer? You've thrown away everything I built, everything I taught you for trees and birds?" The incomprehension was genuine. He truly couldn't process that his son had valued something beyond power and wealth accumulation, that different success metrics existed than the ones he'd spent his life pursuing. "I've thrown away a life that killed my wife through stress and fear, that would eventually kill my son through violence or corruption," Domenico corrected quietly. "I'm keeping the parts that matter. Paolo, connections to people who choose cooperation over conquest, and the ability to sleep without wondering which enemy will move against me tomorrow. You can join me in choosing differently, or you can fight me and lose everything, but you don't get to take what I'm protecting." That option died when I decided my son's future mattered more than my father's approval. Thank you all for following this story. If you've been moved by Domenico's journey from darkness into light, please write in the comments from which place you're watching this story unfold, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support means everything, and helps me continue bringing these stories to life. Until next time, remember that it's never too late to choose differently.